Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Wednesday, September the 27th, 2023. The reading today is from the Old Testament book of Nehemiah, the second chapter. And so I came to Jerusalem and was there for 3 days. Then I got up during the night, and I and a few men with me. And I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I took was the animal I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate, past the Dragon's Spring to the Dung Gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. And then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the animal I was riding to continue. So I went up by way of the valley by night and inspected the wall. Then I turned back and entered the valley gate, and so returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest that were to do the work. And then I said to them, "You see the trouble we're in. Now Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, so that we may no longer suffer disgrace." I told them that the hand of my God had been gracious upon me, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. And then they said, "Let us start building." And so they committed themselves to the common good. Yesterday we started talking about the life gift of our passions or being enthusiastic, and we learned that enthusiasm comes from two Greek words, entheos, meaning with God. So when we are enthusiastic, we are with God in what we're becoming passionate about. And a good example of what we're talking about here is found in that reading this morning. One of the things I like about doing these daily devotions at times is it gives us a chance to spend some time with books in the Bible that we never seem to get around to in the lectionary. For instance, when was the last time you remember hearing a lesson from the book of Nehemiah on Sunday morning? Well, Nehemiah was a Jew who lived in the 5th century BC. He, like many of his fellow Jews in that time, lived in captivity away from his homeland. But apparently his life was not all bad, for we're told that he was a palace servant to the Persian king and queen. Nevertheless, one day some men came from the land of Judah, and Nehemiah asked them about the Jews who had survived and escaped the captivity, and he asked them as well about Jerusalem, the Jewish capital and holy city. And he was told that the survivors still living there were in great trouble and shame, and that the walls of Jerusalem had been destroyed. And when Nehemiah heard these words, he sat down and wept. And then he prayed to God, confessing the sin of his people and asking that God would gather his people together once again. Sometime later, as he was bringing wine to the king noticed his sad face and asked him what was wrong. And Nehemiah answered in chapter 2, verse 3, "Why should my face not be sad, when the city, the place of my ancestors' graves, lies waste, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" And so the king asked him what he'd like to do about it. And Nehemiah answered immediately, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, I ask that you send me to Judah, the city of my ancestors' graves, so that I may rebuild it." And so that's exactly what happened. In our reading this morning, Nehemiah travels to Jerusalem to survey the damage and then to recruit workers to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But in the second verse of our reading, we hear something significant. "Then I got up during the night," he said, "I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem." As the authors of Life Keys point out, the rest of the story is full of drama. The workers hauled stone with one hand while holding their swords in the other to fend off attackers. They worked by day and stood guard over their progress at night. Conspirators hired false prophets to discredit Nehemiah, but the walls were rebuilt in just 52 days. And through it all, Nehemiah was convinced that he was entheos, carrying out God's designs. And what makes the feat even more impressive is the fact, remember, that Nehemiah was only a servant, a cupbearer, the Bible says. And given that he was a household servant, scholars point out it's quite likely that Nehemiah was also a eunuch, which normally would have excluded him from participating in the Jewish community. And so there he was, a lowly servant, outsider to boot. But God put his plan into Nehemiah's heart, and Nehemiah discovered his passion, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And the obvious question, of course, is how do people recognize that those passions come from God? Well, first, they are already in a relationship with God. God's will is inextricably tied to who God is. So when we take the time to know God, we invariably discover what God's will for us is as well. That's what happened to Nehemiah. He just didn't sit down and decide all by himself that he'd be the one to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. No, he first sat down and prayed, and then God put into Nehemiah's heart what he wanted Nehemiah to do. And second, they were able to perceive God at work in their lives. In the 12th chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans, the apostle urges us that we should present ourselves to God as a living sacrifice. We should not be conformed to this world, he says, but rather be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And in that way, we may then discern the will of God. And how about the parable of the sower in Luke's gospel? We're reminded there that God works in our lives by sowing the seed of his word. Those who are good soil, says Jesus, are those who, when they hear the word, hold it fast in an honest and good heart, and then bear fruit with patient endurance. And finally, they already understood how God could use their gifts. They didn't have to stop to analyze the fit. In other words, when a godly passion hits, it's only in people who have honestly taken stock of their own abilities and who know instantly then what to do. In a recent survey, in a survey a few years ago, George Barna asked American adults whether they knew their spiritual gifts. Of those who had even heard of spiritual gifts, fewer than a third could correctly name even one particular gift. Less than a quarter could name a single one of their own spiritual gifts. No wonder, write the authors of Life Keys, why it's so hard to dream about our passions. They then explain that this is why they have us consider our passions only after we understand our other life keys. Because once we've discovered the unique ways in which God has gifted us, it should be easier for us to find those places to serve that have, as they say, our name written all over them. Our authors talk about overcoming the obstacles to use our passions. They remind us that God needs all sorts of different passions. We'll not all be passionate about the same things. Each of us has a season of waiting as well. Sometimes we have to wait for a time in order to perceive our passions. Nehemiah did. His sadness over Jerusalem lying in ruins did not become a passion to rebuild the city overnight. Furthermore, passions come and go as our lives change. They'll not always be the same, even for the same person. I talked about how at 18, football was my passion. In addition to playing the game on Saturdays, Sunday afternoons were then reserved for watching football on TV. Well, some 49 years later, at age 67, I can no longer play football, even if I wanted to. My body couldn't take it. Even more importantly, I'm a pastor now who spends most of his Sunday afternoons at church or visiting the hospital or getting together with members, conducting catechism classes. Rarely, if ever, do I get to sit down in front of the TV with a pro football game, unless, of course, it's the Giants and I have nothing else scheduled. Also, the gifts that you need to carry out your passions may actually be in the people around you. Nehemiah's passion, of course, was to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but it was not a job that he could have done by himself. In other words, he had to enlist the efforts and expertise of others. And finally, if you start with your gifts and join where you see God at work, then you can't be too far from what God has in mind for you. Once again, staying in touch with God is a pretty good way of discovering your godly passions. Well, we're going to end there today and then kind of wrap things up tomorrow on our passions, our enthusiasms. So hope you can join us for part 3 of Life Key number 6, I guess it is. Hope you have a great day today and that you have a chance to tune in again tomorrow. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.